The charming New England community of Wakefield, Massachusetts, Michael Zamiti Jr. and Chester Roberts are found murdered in what appears to be a targeted hit.
We had a double homicide. The town's on edge. Everyone was nervous.
The rumors were flying down the street.
To crack this case, investigators must untangle a web of lies, whose poison spreads far and wide.
There's a lot of money involved.
Sex and love are a classic motive for murder.
I think that added a layer of intensity to the investigation.
Though when the truth finally comes out, the danger proves to be closer to home than anyone could imagine.
Mike Jr. had a few more enemies than anybody thought.
10 miles north of Boston is the sleepy bedroom community of Wakefield, Massachusetts. Iconically New England in every way.
As you drive in, the first thing you see is the Wakefield Town Common. It's very, very pretty.
Wakefield is a picture-perfect postcard. You have bright white church steeples that are extending to the heavens.
Among the oldest towns in the nation, the spirit of the earliest settlers still runs through the veins of its current residents.
New Englanders are tough, they're smart, they're hardworking, and they're ready to help anyone in a heartbeat.
Everybody in Wakefield knows everybody. It's a great place to live and work, great place to bring up your family.
Wakefield's unique because of its people. The safety.
Good morning, everybody.
In March of 2006, 39-year-old Michael Zamiti Jr. is one of Wakefield's most beloved first sons.
Well, not today.
And like most residents who grew up here, he stayed to raise a family.
Okay, I want to hear some good stories when I get
Mike
to tonight.
Zamiti Jr. was a very well-liked guy. He's a family guy, do anything for anybody. Loved to be with his kids.
Everybody later, okay? Have a good day.
Very active in the community and a well-known, well-respected businessman.
Together, Mike and his father and best friend in the world, Mike Sr., run a thriving local company, Allstate Concrete.
They had built a very successful business that had grown dramatically in Boston.
They worked together 7 days a week. It was the American story. They worked very, very hard to build their business up.
When not at work, all of Mike's time is spent with his wife and 3 children, often driving a few hours north to their vacation home in Freedom, New Hampshire, where the whole family can kick back and relax.
The Zamiti family would vacation in Freedom, New Hampshire as a group, 3 generations. Mike Sr., his son, and Michael's children.
They summered together, they spent weekends together, their lives were together all the time.
On Monday morning, March 13th, 2006, after a weekend up in Freedom, Mike Sr. pulls into the parking lot of Allstate Concrete, ready for a busy day.
He usually arrived around 7:30 in the morning, but on that morning he didn't arrive until around 8 o'clock.
No worries for the boss. He knows his son is already there, manning the ship. But when Mike Sr. tries to open the door, he runs into a problem.
It was blocked by something behind it.
When his eyes glance down, he sees that there is a body there, sitting in blood.
Oh my God.
The body was face down. It was extremely dark in the garage. There were no lights on at that time.
He wasn't certain whose body it was, and it alarmed him. He ran out of the building and called 911.
911, this time's recorded. What's your emergency?
I just walked into my garage. I don't know if someone's dead on the floor or not. You gotta come fast.
After placing the call, a terrifying thought runs through Mike Sr.'s head.
I think his first instinct was to make sure that his son Mike was okay.
Mike!
He started yelling his son's name, calling for Michael Jr. He then ran upstairs,
Mike! Mike!
where he discovered behind the desk was his son with a gunshot wound to the face.
Mike!
At around 8:10 a.m., Detective Richard Cass is one of the first Wakefield police officers to arrive on scene. The 29-year veteran cop is shocked by what he finds.
Mike Sr. was by the entrance door, and he was just screaming, Michael, Michael, yelling over and over, they killed my son.
They killed my son. Michael's gone.
Raised in Wakefield, Detective Cass knows the Zamiti family and also has no trouble identifying the body blocking the door.
Behind the door was the body of Chester Roberts, a part-time employee of the Zamiti family. He grew up in Wakefield. He was a well-known figure. Everybody loved Chet Roberts.
Upstairs, the gruesome sight of Mike Jr. is sickening to police, and far too much for his father to bear.
They killed him.
It's okay.
He was not in a frame of mind to be much help at that point in time, so he was actually taken home.
With a double homicide on their hands, Wakefield police must follow a specific protocol.
In Massachusetts, the district attorney's office has jurisdiction over all deaths, and they've delegated that jurisdiction to the state police. We conduct investigations alongside local authorities.
Massachusetts State Trooper Kevin Baker is assigned to the case and races to meet Detective Cass. Though he doesn't have details about the homicides yet, Baker wonders if something bigger is at play.
As soon as I heard that it occurred at a cement company, my first thought that this was probably something related to the organized crime.
Together, Cass and Baker break down the crime scene.
Chester had a single gunshot wound to his back. We found Michael seated in a chair, suffering a gunshot wound to his face and to his torso.
It was determined that both victims were shot by a 16-gauge shotgun with birdshot.
There's no sign of a burglary, and to the seasoned officers, the position of the bodies and gunshot wounds are clues to the killer's intentions.
The closer we examined the scene, the more apparent it became to us that Michael appeared to have been the target of the crime. And Chester appeared to have been ambushed.
The perpetrator laid in wait in hiding. Chester passed him by. He came out from his hiding spot and shot Chester in the back.
He was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Had he come to work 5 minutes late, we might not have had the double homicide.
As investigators process the crime scene, police are hopeful that surveillance cameras in the area captured other valuable clues.
The Allstate Concrete business did not have any working video surveillance, but we canvassed the neighborhood and found a number of other businesses that did.
I was able to retrieve 4 videos, all of varying degrees of helpfulness and clarity. We were able to determine that the murders took place somewhere between 7:40 a.m. and 8:04 a.m.
While police try to secure the area, word of the murders spreads across town.
Upon seeing the police cars, the ambulances, people started gathering around, and you could see in their faces everyone was nervous. The business owners in the neighborhood, the neighbors, the families were upset.
Word traveled pretty quickly in this town.
It's not long before the news of an incident down at Allstate Concrete reaches Mike Jr.'s wife, Michelle.
She rushed down to the business thinking there might have been a construction accident.
I'm Mike's wife. You have to let me through.
The police officer that was present told her that her husband had been found inside, and he told her that he was deceased.
She was told to go home and that we would be in contact with her because we'd want to talk to her about what happened.
But first, Trooper Baker and Detective Cass have someone else they want to speak with.
We are sorry for
The person who discovered the 2 bodies, Mike Jr.'s heartbroken father.
Anything you can tell us today could help us with this case.
Having a conversation like this with parents that have just lost a child is very emotional. And that was part of the case from beginning to end. Everyone was so emotionally involved in the case that we took it personally.
Does he have any enemies? Does he have
The
anyone
first
that's
thing
not
Baker and
like
Cass want to
for
know
no reason?
is who might want to hurt their son.
We have a nephew. His name is Judd.
Mike Sr. is quick to mention Judd Owens, his nephew and a former employee.
I told you what you...
He had worked for the Allstate Concrete Company for several years.
You owe me money, man.
You're getting paid for 8 hours a day.
A dispute had arisen over overtime wages,
Man, I was there 10 hours a day. You
Hey,
saw me.
Bert.
and it resulted in Judd filing a lawsuit against the Zamidi family.
Screw you, man. Take it somewhere else, man.
I will.
Our neighbor,
Mike Jr.'s mother has someone else in mind.
he would hang around my daughter-in-law, Michelle.
She mentions a neighbor up at their summer home in Freedom, New Hampshire, Sean Fitzpatrick.
She had concerns about the relationship between Michelle, her daughter-in-law, and the neighbor, Sean.
In her opinion, Sean was always flirting with Michelle when Mike Jr. wasn't around.
She had seen Michelle in a embrace with Sean.
She thought that this embrace was somewhat inappropriate and that it was a little more than a hug.
I'll see you soon.
Sure. Great.
That's all either of Mike's parents can think of given their state of grief, so the investigators ask them to call if anything else comes to mind. As police focus on the two leads, the town rumor mill is stirring up several different theories about who's behind the double homicide.
The rumors were flying down the street. It's possible that Mike Jr. may have had a few more enemies than anybody thought.
And as detectives dig deeper, they uncover forces at work bigger than anyone is expecting.
We can get this done somewhere else.
It's a cement company after all. We're at the end of the big dig. Gut instinct of a lot of people was whether or not this was mob related.
It's March 13th, 2006, and news of the early morning slayings of Mike Zamidi Jr. and Chester Roberts is already rumbling through the quiet town of Wakefield, Mass.
We have a town to protect. We had a community that was up in arms about what had happened.
Wakefield is safe. This is not something that happens in Wakefield.
The only concrete leads investigators have are Sean Fitzpatrick, a potential jealous lover, and Judd Owens, a disgruntled cousin. According to Mike's parents, each has a bone to pick with their son, despite his popular reputation.
People spoke highly of Mike Jr. It was hard to believe that he had any enemies at all.
While Massachusetts State Trooper Kevin Baker and Wakefield Police Detective Rich Cass track down Judd, they send a team up to Freedom, New Hampshire to question Sean. The small town, known for its beautiful lake, is where the Zamidis own a summer home.
Sean's one of the few year-round residents of the neighborhood that the Zamidis vacationed at. He was known around the neighborhood as someone that was very helpful, and he would often check on people's homes when they were away.
Sean? Hey, you mind if we ask you a few questions?
Sure. What's up?
According to Mike Jr.'s mother, Sean was a little too friendly with Mike's wife, Michelle, and had been caught in an extended embrace with her just 6 months earlier.
How well do you know the Zamidis? They're like family to me.
When officers confront him about a romantic relationship with Michelle, Sean denies it all the way.
He downplayed it, said there was nothing to it, that they were just really good friends.
The incident over the hug was simply a misunderstanding and something that got blown out of proportion.
Where were you Monday morning? I was here.
What's more, he was nowhere near Wakefield the morning of the murders.
I am her. She's my neighbor.
He claims he was at home and remembers exchanging hellos with his neighbor,
Hello, Sean.
Amber DeRoches.
Sean was very specific and told us that Amber had seen him just after 9 a.m.
Sean also swears by his close friendship with the Zamidis. They're like family.
Call me uncle.
He would do anything for the Zamidis. He was very close with Michael Jr. and the children.
The kids absolutely adored him and often referred to him as Uncle Sean.
Oh, you're welcome, my friend.
Hey, cool, thanks.
Oh, you're welcome, man. He's a great kid.
Look at him go, hey, man. Yeah.
When asked who'd want to murder Mike, Sean says it's obvious.
He strongly suspected that this had to have been an organized crime type of incident.
They asked him why he thought that, and he referred to the business that they were in.
The Zamidi Cement Company is a big success, and not for nothing, according to Sean. He's convinced Mike Jr. and his dad were dealing with the mob.
You got this wrong. You got everything wrong.
Mike Sr. was a very aggressive businessman.
What are you, an idiot?
He was not afraid to get into the mix with the players. And he's a tough guy.
You're fired.
Maybe Mike could be involved in some of this rough and tumble stuff.
Get out of here.
We didn't know.
It's something they'll need to investigate back in Wakefield. Detectives tell Sean they'll be in touch. Then, they check on Sean's alibi with his neighbor, Amber DeRoches.
Amber told us she went for a walk at a very specific time every single morning. That included walking by Sean's house.
The same exact route every day. She would wait for the clock to turn to 9 o'clock.
That morning, she had seen Sean, and he was hanging out in front of his house, having coffee.
She saw him and waved to him.
Hello, Amber.
Hello, Sean.
Since Freedom is a 2-hour drive from Wakefield, it appears to put Sean in the clear.
Knowing the murder had occurred between 7:40 a.m. and 8:04 a.m., we knew it would be impossible for Sean to have traveled and be seen by 9:15 in Freedom, New Hampshire.
Back in Wakefield, Mass., town rumors reinforce what Sean just told police in Freedom, and what Cass and Baker suspected from the start. The double homicide at Allstate Concrete has all the makings of a mob deal gone bad.
Most of the people around town believed that this was some type of organized crime mob hit involving the cement business. They didn't think the case would ever be solved.
Word on the street is that the Zamidis may have crossed the wrong guys while working on Boston's Big Dig, a massive highway and tunnel project plagued by corruption and payoffs.
If you were able to get into the Big Dig, there was a lot of money for you as a contractor to make, and the Zamidis got into it. When we found out that there was a lot of work and a lot of money coming back to Mike Zamidi, we took a look at it.
Trooper Baker and Detective Cass must work quickly before the mafia rumors caused the good people of Wakefield to clam up.
We still had a lot of work to do. We had a lot of people that we needed to follow up with, and we had a lot of unanswered questions.
3 days after the murders, Michelle Zamidi, Mike Jr.'s grieving widow, is ready to talk to police and answer questions she was unable to deal with at the crime scene. Though still shell-shocked by her husband's murder, she offers to help any way she can.
Yeah, that's all I have for him.
Michelle was very forthcoming with information. She provided us everyone that Michael was friends with, that Michael associated with.
But she didn't think he had any enemies that would rise to that level.
When they ask about her relationship with Sean, Michelle is surprised by the question.
She did not believe that Sean Fitzpatrick could be involved in this murder. He was a friend of the family and was very close to her and her family and her children.
Is there anything else you want to tell us?
Then, Michelle suddenly breaks down with a startling confession.
The friendship that was already a strong friendship eventually deepened into something more. It was an affair.
Michelle was very embarrassed and ashamed about her relationship with Sean. But as we talked to her more about it, she became very open.
One of the reasons Michelle gave for this relationship was the fact that her husband worked so many hours and was home very little.
The affair had lasted about a year until she called it quits with Sean about 6 months earlier.
Michelle and Michael had gone to marriage counseling, and she felt that things were actually improving.
She didn't believe that Sean was capable of doing this.
Still, Michelle's revelation about her romance with Sean has detectives wondering if his alibi is as rock solid as they previously believed. On March 18th, 5 days after the murders, family and friends gathered to grieve the loss of Mike Jr.
It was as large of a funeral as we've ever had in Wakefield. The amount of people was just staggering. Mike was remembered as a fun-loving guy, very well liked in the community.
Mike was the type of person that you knew he was in the room, you knew he was in the neighborhood because he brought sunlight to the day.
Among those attending Mike Jr.'s funeral is his cousin, Judd Owens, one-time disgruntled employee of Allstate Concrete. Having sued the Zamitis over a wage dispute, Judd is next on Cass and Baker's list.
We made contact with Judd Owens and tried to discuss his relationship with the Zamitis.
But he wouldn't talk to us unless we talked to his attorney. This was a strange reaction, considering the fact that we're investigating the murder of his cousin. It didn't sit very well with us.
It was a red flag when he refused.
In March 2006, the town of Wakefield, Massachusetts lays to rest two of its most cherished citizens, Michael Zamiti Jr. and Chester Roberts. With their double murder still unsolved, investigators reach out to perhaps the last viable lead left, Mike's cousin and former Allstate Concrete employee, Judd Owens. His refusal to come in for questioning leaves police highly suspicious.
When somebody doesn't come in for questioning, an alarm goes off. Why? What are you trying to hide?
We had to find out where he was, what he was doing, what he had been doing in his life in the interim since he had left the company.
Man, I'm tired of this. You owe me when I got...
Several years earlier, according to Mike's parents, Judd and the Zamitis had a falling out.
Well, where am I going to get the money? I got rent. I got responsibility.
This disagreement was over pay for overtime wages during the Big Dig project.
You trying to lean on the cousin cause?
It was an issue that grew to be larger than life.
Take it out of here. You, man. Go on.
Judd insists they speak to his attorney.
He was concerned that he'd be violating the non-disclosure agreement if he spoke to the police.
Once his attorney said it was okay, he was very open with us about what had occurred and about the lawsuit. He was very happy with his settlement. As far as he was concerned, that chapter was over and done with.
Still, they want to know where he was when Mike Jr. and Chester were gunned down.
His alibi was that that morning he was up in Newburyport, Mass. At his workplace, which is 30 miles north of here.
Judd was very clear to us that he had no involvement in this crime.
Investigators notified Judd that until they verify his alibi, he'll remain a person of interest. They're not convinced his feelings toward the Zamitis are as cordial as he claims, especially since it was Mike Sr. who suggested Judd was someone they should look into.
Judd might actually have a reason to hurt Mike Jr. Money is a classic motive for murder.
Meanwhile, police have completed their analysis of the surveillance video collected near the crime scene, and they've discovered what could be a critical clue.
We were able to determine from the video evidence that Michael had arrived that morning at work at 7:40 a.m.
Several minutes after that, a second vehicle is seen entering the lot. The second vehicle was a dark-colored Ford pickup truck.
Within a minute or so of that vehicle entering the property, Chester Roberts was seen on video walking towards Allstate Concrete. Approximately 4 minutes later, we saw that same vehicle fleeing the general direction of Allstate Concrete.
We could not see the plate number on it. We could not see an operator of the vehicle.
Police think they have their getaway vehicle, but can they match a suspect to the dark-colored pickup?
Trooper Baker.
2 weeks after the murders, Trooper Baker gets a call that could be the break they're waiting for. Several burglaries have been reported where the Zamitis vacation in Freedom, New Hampshire.
We learned that 3 houses have been broken into. What was of interest to us is one of the houses was the Zamitis' own home, and they had occurred at a time that overlapped the period of time that the murder had occurred in.
Trooper Baker and Detective Cass drive up to Freedom to investigate, hoping to find something that connects to the murders.
We just thought it was too much of a coincidence that 3 breaks occurred in this neighborhood.
When contacted by police, Mike Sr. says he's aware of the break-in, but hasn't had a chance to check on it since the murders occurred.
We told him which rooms had been disturbed. He then explained to us what was in each room and what should be where. We learned that a 16-gauge shotgun was missing. Birdshot was also missing, which is the same type ammunition used in our murders.
We strongly believe that the gun that was stolen from Mike's own house was the one that was used to kill him.
As Trooper Baker waits for the forensics team to arrive, Detective Cass is eager to have a look around, and his curiosity pays off big time.
As I walked through the neighborhood, tucked in between the wood line was a Ford pickup, dark green. I got very excited. It resembled the vehicle that we first saw in that videotape. I felt this was our vehicle. I really thought that this was going to be a game changer. This was the first real lead that we had.
Two weeks after the murders of Michael Zamiti Jr. and Chester Roberts, the New England town of Wakefield, Mass. Is still rattled. The close community anxiously awaits answers from the police, though many fear the mob is involved and wonder if the case will ever be solved.
The town's on edge. You could see in their faces everyone was nervous.
There was a family in town that everybody knew. They knew the children, they knew the business. I think that added a layer of intensity to the investigation.
But 100 miles away in Freedom, New Hampshire, investigators have made a discovery that may bring an end to Wakefield's fears. Wakefield police detective Rich Cassidy spots a truck in a neighboring driveway close to the Zamitis' vacation home. That looks a lot like the one seen in surveillance video collected near the crime scene.
Baker, come take a look.
Covered in dirt and grime, the truck looks like it hasn't been driven in months, except for one telltale sign.
There was an area near the keyhole in the door handle that was clean, as if someone's hand had rubbed when they opened the door.
It showed me that someone had driven that vehicle recently. The fact that it was diagonally across the street from the Zamiti senior's home made us feel that this could be important.
If it's the getaway car, it could lead straight to the killer. When police run the plates, they learn the truck belongs to Pat Caldwell, a seasonal resident who's spending the winter in Florida. Within hours, detectives reach him on the phone.
He explained to us that he hadn't been up to New Hampshire or driven his vehicle in months.
Pat was clear to us. The car should have been left in his driveway, untouched. No one had permission to use it.
Judging from the swipe on the door, someone did use it.
If it was a truck we were looking for, there was probably a lot of evidence in that truck. So the only way to get that evidence is with consent of the owner or by search warrant.
Pat was very cooperative and told us we could do whatever we wanted with it.
With permission to search the vehicle, police are confident Pat had nothing to do with the murders. Plus, he's got an alibi.
There was nothing that we could determine that gave Mr. Caldwell the motive to harm the Zamitis.
They were neighbors, they were friendly, and he was in Florida for the entire winter.
As the truck is sent to Massachusetts for forensic testing, detectives can't help but recall that Sean Fitzpatrick lives nearby. They hold off on confronting him until they have solid evidence from the truck analysis. Trouble is, it could take weeks for results. In the meantime, investigators follow up on Judd Owens, Mike Jr.'s cousin.
Judd had told us he was at work the morning of the murder in Newburyport, Massachusetts. We were able to corroborate that through his payroll records and through interviewing people at his employer.
What's more, no one has heard Judd even mention the Zamitis for years.
After settling in court, Judd really doesn't have anything to gain by murdering his cousin. As far as Judd was concerned, it's just water under the bridge.
Judd Owens is cleared of any involvement with the murders. And with him scratched off the list, all hopes hinge on Pat Caldwell's truck and the secrets it might reveal. 2 days after seizing the vehicle, investigators get their first clue.
Shortly after we took possession of Pat's truck, he called us to tell us he was concerned. He had looked into his vehicle's Easy Pass records.
His Ford pickup truck has a transponder that when you go through toll booths, registers and pays for your toll.
On the morning of the murder, the Easy Pass had registered on one of the toll booths in New Hampshire.
But there are 3 tolls between Freedom and Wakefield. A round trip would register 6 times. Why it showed only once is a mystery.
The Easy Pass transaction that had registered was at the Dover tolls northbound.
This means Pat's truck passed through one of the tolls heading north from Wakefield to Freedom within an hour after the murder. And if the killer was at the wheel, could there be other clues left inside? It takes another 2 weeks before the lab analysis has an answer.
We were hopeful to find fingerprints in the vehicle, but the only prints we found were Mr. Caldwell's.
But that's not unusual. If you plan on taking someone's vehicle, traveling to Massachusetts to kill someone, you're probably going to wear gloves.
It's not all bad news.
The crime lab was able to find DNA in the steering wheel, the gear shift lever, and the ignition key in the truck.
Though the DNA in the truck doesn't match anyone in the nationwide database, the investigators are hopeful.
We didn't have a match at this point, but it's still one more piece of evidence that we felt eventually would help us.
And one suspect comes to mind. The only person of interest whom they questioned in Freedom, Sean Fitzpatrick. Despite his solid alibi, investigators revisit their initial hunch that Sean killed Mike out of passion for his wife, Michelle.
We could see a love triangle potentially building here, which is changing the focus of the investigation.
Just when they think they have their man, a startling twist takes the investigation in a whole new direction. Almost 6 weeks after the murders, Mike's mother arrives at the Wakefield police station, eager to show something to police.
The Zamitis received a threatening letter at their house.
She reached into her pocketbook to take the letter out, at which time I asked her not to touch it.
The terrifying thing was that it reads, "Close now or lose more family."
Massachusetts State Trooper Kevin Baker and Wakefield Detective Rich Cass have just been blindsided with a new lead in the double homicide case of Michael Zamiti Jr. and Chester Roberts. Almost a month and a half after the murders, Mike Jr.'s parents receive a threatening letter in the mail.
It was an old-fashioned ransom note where they cut letters out of a newspaper, pieced them together to form words.
The entire Zamiti family was incredibly upset by it. The crime was still unsolved, they were still uneasy, maybe the business was a target.
It would seem the town rumors are true, that the Zamiti business got in bed with the wrong people. Did Mike Jr. get whacked because he didn't play ball with the mob? Investigators aren't so sure.
When I first looked at the letter, I felt that it was someone trying a little too hard to get us to focus on the business and not focus on other evidence that we were obtaining.
In fact, there's nothing in the company books to suggest the Zamitis ran a shady business.
Their financials, their contracts, their dealings with other businesses, we found nothing out of the ordinary.
We knew that they were clean. Either somebody is trying to throw us off or somebody knows something.
The letter is sent to the crime lab to check for prints that could identify the culprit. But investigators have little doubt who's behind it. Sean Fitzpatrick. After all, it was he who was quick to blame the mob for Mike's murder.
So our goal was to get Sean in to talk to us and hopefully be able to secure a print from him.
But this time, Sean's not as amenable.
When we went back the second time to speak to Sean, he had immediately shut us down.
He refused to talk to us. He told us that we needed to speak to his attorney.
Hi, Sean.
We were very surprised by his reaction, that it went from being so cordial and friendly
Without my attorney.
to adversarial.
Sean's stonewalling only encourages the investigators. Certain they have their man, they get a warrant to take his prints. Police turn their attention back to the DNA evidence found in the truck.
So they have the truck, but they don't have anything to compare with.
At that point, we didn't have a sample of Sean's DNA.
Then it hits Trooper Baker, who recalls something he saw at Michelle's house.
Michelle had received a sympathy card from Sean shortly after the murder expressing his condolences. We could use the envelope flap, which we believed he had licked, to compare to the DNA in Pat Caldwell's truck.
Even if they can link Sean's DNA to the truck, there's still the issue of Sean's alibi, his neighbor, Amber DeRoche's, and whether he had time to make the 100-mile drive to Wakefield and back.
On the morning of the murders, Sean said he saw Amber around 9:15 in the morning.
Hello, Amber.
Hello, Sean.
When investigators return to Freedom to question Amber, she disputes Sean's recall.
Amber is extremely particular about her schedule. She knows what time she's coming and going. The day of the homicides in Wakefield, she didn't have her usual routine of taking her daily walk. Her schedule was different because she was helping out a friend.
She returned home between 9:30 and 9:45 and then went on her walk. That's when she saw Sean.
Hello, Sean.
Amber is absolutely certain that her time is correct, not Sean's time.
That's 30 minutes later than what Sean said, widening the window of time for him to leave the crime scene, return home, and see Amber.
Depending on traffic, the drive from Freedom, New Hampshire to Wakefield, Mass. is an hour and a half to an hour and 40 minutes.
The time that Mr. Caldwell's transponder passed through the toll was exactly within that window.
The murders took place shortly before 8 o'clock in the morning. A truck leaving Wakefield would arrive in Freedom around 9:30 in the morning. That's plenty of time for Sean to try to establish an alibi by seeing Amber.
The evidence against Sean is piling up quickly. Within 2 weeks of receiving the fake mob letter, lab techs matched Sean's prints to a palm print found on the envelope. DNA testing of the sympathy card delivers the final piece of the puzzle.
When we learned that the DNA that was found in the truck was a match to the DNA on the sympathy card, we knew we had enough to get an arrest warrant for Sean.
We had DNA. We had palm prints. We had video. We had toll booth records. We can show that there was a motive. Sean had no alibi. We had no doubt in our mind that Sean Fitzpatrick committed these murders.
On June 6, 2006, almost 3 months after the murders of Michael Zamiti Jr. and Chester Roberts, Sean is arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. According to prosecutors, his motive was an obsession with Mike's wife, Michelle.
Sean had actually fallen in love, and he had plans, in his mind at least, that she was going to leave Mike and start a life together.
When Michelle rejected him, he killed both of these people.
Sean pleads innocent, and at his trial 2 years later, prosecutors describe how they believe he carried out the double murder on the morning of March 13, 2006.
Sean drove Mr. Caldwell's vehicle through 3 toll booths, paid cash, arrived in Wakefield somewhere around 7:30 in the morning.
He waited for Michael Zamiti to arrive at work. Sean followed him in several minutes later and confronted him with the shotgun that he had previously taken from the Zamiti's vacation home.
No! No!
He shot him once to the abdomen and then got closer and shot him directly in the face.
Sean then fled the building, but while he was fleeing, he encountered Chester.
He then hid, came out from behind Chester, and shot him in the back.
Sean then got back into Mr. Caldwell's truck and drove it back up to New Hampshire.
He paid cash at all 3 toll booths again. Arrived home, parked the car in Mr. Caldwell's yard.
He then waited outside hoping that Amber would pass by and establish his alibi, that he was home the whole morning.
Case closed, his life is going to be wonderful. Michael Zimity's out of the way, and Sean and Michael's wife will live happily together ever after. It didn't work that way.
On February 23, 2009, the judge hands Sean Fitzpatrick 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole. He's never charged for the burglaries in Freedom, New Hampshire. Michelle is fully cleared of any involvement in the murder of her husband or Chester Roberts. With Sean behind bars, the Zimities and the Roberts try to resume a normal life.
After Michael Jr. was murdered, Michael Sr. didn't keep on with the business. I don't think he could go back and do that job without his son. He lost his best friend.
And it rocked this tough little New England town to its core.
We carry on as a community, we carry on as neighbors and friends, but there's always going to be that scar of what this town and what the Zimity family and all of us went through. And we'll never forget.
Wakefield lost 2 very important souls that day. 2 people that were friends of many, 2 people that helped the community to thrive on a daily basis. It will never be the same without these 2 people. These New Englanders are strong, but the hurt will always be there.
The last place anyone expected evil to hide was inside a church. On an April evening in 1960, the streets of McAllen, Texas, settled into the familiar rhythm of Holy Week. Families gathered for prayer. Church bells echoed through the warm spring air. Doors remained unlocked. Neighbors greeted each other by name. It was the kind of town where faith was woven into everyday life, where priests were trusted without question, and where a young woman walking alone after sunset rarely sparked concern. Then Irene Garza disappeared. At first, no one imagined that those few missing hours would become one of the most haunting cold cases in Texas history. There was no ransom demand, no screams reported in the night, no obvious signs of violence. One moment, the 25-year-old schoolteacher was preparing for Easter like thousands of other devoted Catholics. The next, she had vanished without leaving behind so much as a single clue. Her disappearance ignited panic almost immediately. Friends retraced her steps. Family members called hospitals. Volunteers searched roadsides, empty lots, irrigation canals, and nearby fields. Police questioned anyone who might have seen her after dusk. Every passing hour deepened the fear that something far darker than a simple misunderstanding had occurred. Nobody knew that the answer had already been buried beneath still water. Long before her name appeared in newspaper headlines, Irene Garza represented everything the small South Texas community admired. She was intelligent, deeply religious, and remarkably accomplished. Raised in McAllen by a close-knit Mexican-American family, she excelled academically from an early age. Those who knew her described her as warm, disciplined, and compassionate. She possessed the quiet confidence of someone devoted to helping others rather than seeking attention for herself. Teaching was more than a profession. It was a calling. Her students remembered her patience. Parents admired her kindness. Friends recalled an infectious smile that rarely disappeared, even during difficult days. She carried herself with optimism, believing faith and hard work could overcome almost anything. It was precisely that trust which made what happened next so impossible to comprehend. Holy Week held special meaning for Irene. Like many practicing Catholics, she intended to receive the sacrament of reconciliation before Easter Sunday. Confession was a sacred ritual, a private conversation between penitent and priest that existed behind an unbreakable wall of secrecy and spiritual trust. On the evening of April 16, 1960, Irene left home intending to visit Sacred Heart Church. She never returned. When family members realized she had failed to come home, Concern escalated rapidly. This wasn't someone known for disappearing unexpectedly. Irene was responsible, predictable. If plans changed, she always informed someone. Hours passed with no telephone call, no message, no explanation. The search expanded overnight. Law enforcement officers canvassed neighborhoods while volunteers formed search parties stretching across Hidalgo County. Local radio stations interrupted programming to announce her disappearance. Churches urged parishioners to remain vigilant. Every reported sighting generated hope before collapsing into disappointment. As dawn broke, fear began replacing optimism. The longer Irene remained missing, the more investigators suspected they were confronting something far more sinister than an accident. Then came the discovery. Several days after Irene disappeared, workers searching along a canal outside McAllen noticed something floating in the water. It was her body. The discovery shattered the community. Instead of bringing answers, it unleashed a wave of horrifying new questions. Investigators immediately recognized that Irene had not drowned accidentally. The circumstances surrounding her death suggested deliberate violence. Medical examination revealed injuries indicating she had been assaulted before her body entered the canal. She had also been strangled. The combination of physical evidence pointed unmistakably toward homicide. Shock spread through McAllen with astonishing speed. Parents refused to let daughters walk alone. Businesses closed earlier than usual. Church parking lots emptied quickly after evening services. The assumption that such brutality belonged only to distant cities collapsed almost overnight. Detectives launched an aggressive investigation, convinced that solving the murder quickly depended upon reconstructing Irene's final known movements. Witnesses confirmed she had planned to attend confession. That detail instantly transformed Sacred Heart Church into the center of the investigation. Police interviewed clergy, parishioners, maintenance workers, and anyone present that evening. They sought timelines measured in minutes. Who entered first? Who left last? Did anyone notice an unfamiliar vehicle? Had Irene appeared nervous? Was she seen speaking with anyone before disappearing? The answers proved frustratingly incomplete. Some remembered seeing Irene arrive. Others recalled little. The passage of time between her disappearance and the discovery of her body had already begun erasing memories that might have become critical evidence. Still, investigators believed someone inside the church possessed information they were not sharing. The challenge lay in proving it. Unlike modern detectives equipped with surveillance cameras, mobile phone records, GPS tracking, and digital forensics, investigators in 1960 relied heavily upon eyewitness testimony and physical evidence collected at crime scenes. DNA analysis did not exist. Security cameras were virtually unheard of. Fingerprint comparison remained slow and limited. A killer capable of avoiding obvious mistakes could disappear with alarming ease. As officers searched for evidence, rumors spread throughout McAllen. Some whispered Irene had encountered a stranger. Others believed someone had followed her from church. More unsettling theories emerged quietly behind closed doors, spoken only in trusted company because they seemed almost unimaginable. Could someone inside the church know more than they admitted? Few dared voice that suspicion publicly. The Catholic Church occupied a position of profound respect throughout the community. Priests were viewed as moral authorities whose words carried extraordinary weight. Suggesting one might somehow be connected to such an unspeakable crime bordered on sacrilege for many residents. Even so, detectives could not ignore any possibility. Every individual connected with Irene's final known destination required scrutiny. Interviews continued for days. Then weeks. Then months. Yet the investigation failed to produce enough evidence to identify a killer. Newspaper coverage intensified. Headlines described a promising young teacher, whose life had ended in terrifying violence. Reporters questioned whether a dangerous predator remained free. Editorials demanded justice while urging calm. Citizens flooded police with tips ranging from plausible observations to wildly speculative accusations. Each lead required attention. Each consumed valuable time. Many ended nowhere. Among the countless interviews conducted during those early weeks were conversations with members of the clergy connected to Sacred Heart Church. Publicly, they expressed grief. They urged prayer. They comforted Irene's devastated family. Behind the scenes, investigators searched carefully for inconsistencies. None appeared substantial enough to justify criminal charges. Without forensic breakthroughs, suspicion alone meant little. The case drifted into uncertainty. Months passed. Season followed season. Evidence aged. Witnesses moved away. Memories blurred. What had once dominated every conversation gradually yielded space to ordinary life, though Irene herself remained impossible to forget. Her family refused to accept silence. Every birthday arrived carrying another painful reminder. Every Easter reopened wounds that had never fully healed. Photographs of Irene remained displayed throughout the family home, preserving the smile that murder had stolen but memory refused to surrender. Detectives, too, struggled with unfinished business. Cold cases possess a unique cruelty. Unlike solved investigations, they never truly conclude. Files remain open. Evidence sits boxed inside storage rooms. Detectives retire or pass away while unanswered questions survive them. Each new investigator inherits not merely documents but expectations from grieving families who have waited years, or decades, for justice. The Garza case became exactly that. Boxes accumulated. Reports yellowed with age. Evidence preservation methods of the era left much to be desired. Materials that today would be carefully sealed and cataloged sometimes endured handling procedures unimaginable by modern forensic standards. Yet despite these limitations, investigators preserved what they believed might someday prove important. No one could predict how valuable those forgotten pieces would become. As the 1960s unfolded, America changed dramatically. New technologies emerged. Scientific understanding expanded. Criminal investigations evolved. Yet Irene's murder remained frozen in time. Every anniversary prompted renewed newspaper articles asking the same painful question. Who killed Irene Garza? The absence of an answer became part of the tragedy itself. Residents who had been children during the search grew into adults telling the story to their own families. New generations inherited not only the facts but also the unease surrounding the case. Parents continued warning daughters to remain vigilant. Older citizens recalled exactly where they stood when news of Irene's body reached town. The murder transformed from current event into local legend. But legends often conceal uncomfortable truths. Within law enforcement circles, investigators occasionally revisited overlooked statements, hoping fresh eyes might recognize patterns invisible decades earlier. Small inconsistencies surfaced. Certain timelines remained difficult to reconcile. Some interviews acquired greater significance with hindsight than they possessed originally. Yet none crossed the threshold separating suspicion from proof. Without proof, justice remained out of reach. Unknown to nearly everyone involved, the future of the investigation would not depend upon a dramatic confession or an eyewitness finally breaking decades of silence. It would depend upon science that had not yet been invented. For years, the evidence waited quietly inside sealed containers, forgotten by much of the world but never entirely abandoned. While the files gathered dust, forensic laboratories across the country pushed criminal investigation into an entirely new era. Tiny biological traces once considered useless would soon become powerful witnesses, capable of identifying individuals decades after crimes occurred. The people responsible for Irene Garza's investigation could not yet know it. But somewhere within those aging files rested fragments of a story that time had failed to erase. And one day, after half a century buried beneath silence, those fragments would begin speaking louder than any witness ever could. On the evening of April 16, 1960, the city of McAllen, Texas, was preparing for Easter Sunday. Families attended church services. Parishioners lined up for confession. For most residents, Holy Week represented renewal, forgiveness, and faith. For 25-year-old Irene Garza, it would become the final evening of her life. More than half a century later, investigators would finally identify the man responsible for her death. But by then, the suspect himself would already be dead, leaving behind one of the most extraordinary examples of how modern forensic science can answer questions that once seemed impossible. This is the story of Irene Garza. Irene Garza was born and raised in McAllen, a predominantly Mexican-American community in South Texas. Friends and family remembered her as intelligent, disciplined, and deeply devoted to her Catholic faith. She had graduated from college and was working as an elementary school teacher, earning admiration for both her professionalism and her compassion toward students. She was also well known within her parish. Those who knew Irene consistently described her as kind, optimistic, and committed to helping others. Nothing in her daily routine suggested that she was living under any threat. She came from a close family, maintained strong friendships, and had plans for the future. By every account, she was exactly the kind of person whose disappearance would immediately alarm an entire community. Saturday, April 16th, was the day before Easter Sunday. As was customary during Holy Week, many Catholics attended confession. Irene told members of her family that she intended to visit Sacred Heart Catholic Church that evening. It was an ordinary decision. No one imagined it would be the last time they would ever see her alive. When Irene failed to return home later that night, concern quickly grew. This was highly unusual behavior. She was dependable, punctual, and maintained regular contact with her family. As the hours passed, relatives contacted friends, neighbors, and eventually law enforcement. The search began almost immediately. Police officers interviewed family members to establish Irene's movements throughout the day. Volunteers searched nearby roads, vacant fields, and irrigation canals surrounding McAllen. Churches informed parishioners about the disappearance, while local newspapers and radio stations urged anyone with information to contact authorities. Initially, investigators considered several possibilities. Perhaps Irene had suffered an accident. Perhaps her vehicle had broken down. Perhaps someone had seen her leave the church. Every possible lead was examined. Then, 5 days later, on April 21st, searchers made a devastating discovery. Irene's body was found floating in a canal several miles from where she had last been seen. The discovery transformed a missing person investigation into a homicide inquiry. The medical examination revealed evidence that Irene had been sexually assaulted before her death. Investigators also determined she had died from asphyxiation caused by strangulation. The circumstances indicated that this had not been a random accident. Someone had attacked her. Someone had deliberately taken her life. The murder shocked South Texas. McAllen had experienced crime before, but the killing of a respected young schoolteacher during Holy Week carried enormous emotional weight. The timing, the location, and Irene's reputation all combined to make the case especially disturbing. Detectives immediately focused on reconstructing Irene's final known movements. Witnesses confirmed that she had gone to Sacred Heart Church for confession. That fact made the church a central focus of the investigation. Police interviewed parish staff, clergy members, church employees, and parishioners who had attended services that evening. Detectives attempted to establish who had spoken with Irene, who had seen her arrive, and whether anyone had noticed unusual activity around the church. The investigation was extensive by the standards of 1960. However, investigators faced significant limitations. DNA profiling did not yet exist. Security cameras were not available. Cell phone records, GPS tracking, and digital surveillance, all routine investigative tools today, were decades away. Instead, detectives depended heavily on eyewitness testimony, physical evidence, and interviews. Unfortunately, memories fade quickly. Witnesses often remembered only fragments. Some accounts conflicted with others. Small gaps in the timeline became increasingly difficult to resolve. Among those interviewed was Father John Fite, a Catholic priest serving in the Diocese of Brownsville. According to records from the investigation, Father Fite acknowledged hearing Irene's confession on the evening she disappeared. At that stage, however, investigators did not possess sufficient evidence to charge him with any crime. The interview nevertheless became an important part of the case file. Over the following months, investigators continued gathering statements from dozens of individuals connected to Irene's final known movements. Physical evidence was examined using the forensic methods available at the time. Despite these efforts, no arrest was made. The investigation gradually slowed. For Irene's family, however, time offered little comfort. Every holiday served as a reminder of the loss. Every anniversary reopened unanswered questions. Who had attacked Irene? Why had she been targeted? Could the killer still be living in the community? Those questions remained unanswered throughout the 1960s. Yet behind the scenes, investigators continued receiving information. Some witnesses later reported statements allegedly made by Father Fite concerning events surrounding Irene's death. Others described conversations that raised additional suspicions. These reports attracted serious attention from law enforcement. However, suspicion alone could not support a criminal conviction. Investigators needed corroborating evidence. Throughout the following decades, the case remained officially unsolved. The files grew larger. Detectives retired. Evidence was transferred between storage facilities. What had once been an active homicide investigation slowly became one of Texas' most well-known cold cases. Even so, Irene's family never stopped seeking answers. Journalists periodically revisited the case. Local newspapers published anniversary stories. Television reports reminded viewers that the investigation remained open. The passage of time did not erase public interest. Instead, it reinforced the sense that justice had somehow remained unfinished. By the late 20th century, criminal investigations across the United States began entering a new era. Forensic science was advancing rapidly. DNA profiling emerged as one of the most significant developments in modern criminal justice. Cases once considered impossible to solve were suddenly reopened. Evidence collected decades earlier acquired entirely new significance. Biological material preserved from crime scenes could now be analyzed using techniques unavailable to earlier investigators. Across the country, cold case units began reviewing historical investigations with fresh eyes. Among the files waiting on storage shelves was the murder of Irene Garza. What detectives in 1960 could not have imagined was that evidence collected during the original investigation, carefully preserved despite the technological limitations of the era, might one day answer questions that witnesses never could. The challenge was no longer simply identifying a suspect. It was determining whether the surviving evidence remained suitable for modern forensic examination. As laboratories improved their ability to recover DNA from older materials, investigators recognized that Irene's case deserved another review. It would become one of the most important decisions in the history of the investigation. Because after decades of uncertainty, the evidence itself was about to speak in a way it never had before. For decades, the investigation into Irene Garza's murder remained open but largely inactive. The physical evidence collected in 1960 had been preserved, yet the scientific tools capable of extracting its full value did not exist when detectives first examined the case. What investigators had once viewed as limited forensic material would eventually become the foundation of a renewed inquiry. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Irene's family continued to seek answers. Local journalists periodically revisited the case, especially around the anniversary of her disappearance. Each new article repeated the same unanswered questions. Who killed Irene Garza? Why had no one been charged? Could the case still be solved after so many years? The murder had become more than an unsolved crime. It had become part of the history of the Rio Grande Valley. Meanwhile, advances in forensic science were transforming criminal investigations across the United States. DNA profiling, introduced into American criminal investigations during the late 1980s, soon demonstrated its ability to identify suspects, exclude innocent individuals, and reopen cases that had once appeared impossible to solve. As laboratories became more sophisticated, investigators around the country began reviewing decades-old evidence. Biological samples that had once seemed insignificant were now capable of yielding valuable genetic information. The Garza case was among those that benefited from this technological revolution. Cold case investigators carefully reviewed every surviving document from the original investigation. Police reports, witness interviews, medical records, photographs, laboratory reports, and preserved evidence were re-examined. The objective was not simply to repeat the work of detectives from 1960, but to determine whether modern forensic techniques could reveal information that had been beyond the reach of earlier investigators. The review also highlighted a significant feature of the original case. Although no criminal charges had been filed, investigators in 1960 had documented information concerning Father John Fite, the priest who had heard Irene's confession on the evening she disappeared. His role had attracted investigative attention early in the case because he was among the last known people to have seen Irene alive. Over the years, additional witnesses came forward with statements that investigators considered relevant. Some reported conversations involving Father Fite. Others recalled remarks allegedly made years after the murder. These accounts varied in detail and were evaluated alongside the existing evidence. Witness testimony alone, however, remained insufficient to establish criminal responsibility. Prosecutors require evidence that can withstand legal scrutiny. Memories can fade. Recollections may differ after many years. Detectives therefore continued searching for objective evidence capable of corroborating witness accounts. As forensic science advanced, preserved biological evidence became increasingly important. Investigators submitted items retained from the original case for renewed laboratory examination. Modern DNA testing offered opportunities that simply had not existed during the early decades of the investigation. At the same time, investigators also reconstructed Father Fite's life after 1960. Following Irene's death, Fite remained within the Catholic Church for several years before eventually leaving the priesthood. He later married and built a different life outside active ministry. His subsequent career did not erase the questions surrounding the Garza investigation. Instead, those questions quietly followed him for decades. Law enforcement agencies responsible for the case maintained contact with prosecutors as new information emerged. Progress was often slow. Cold case investigations rarely produced dramatic breakthroughs overnight. Instead, they typically advance through the careful accumulation of evidence gathered over many years. Every document was reviewed. Every prior interview was reconsidered. Every surviving piece of evidence was evaluated for its forensic potential. Investigators also worked to locate individuals who had participated in the original investigation or who possessed knowledge relevant to the case. Although many witnesses had died or could no longer recall precise details, others were still able to provide information that helped clarify events surrounding April 1960. Some retired investigators also shared their observations regarding the original inquiry. Historical context proved important. The investigative standards, forensic capabilities, and legal procedures available in 1960 differed substantially from those available decades later. Modern detectives therefore approached the case with an understanding of those limitations, while applying contemporary investigative methods wherever possible. As evidence accumulated, prosecutors became increasingly confident that the case deserved renewed attention. The investigation was no longer based solely upon historical suspicion. It was becoming an evidence-driven review supported by advances in forensic science and the careful reassessment of witness testimony collected over many years. Another important development also strengthened the investigation. By the early 21st century, prosecutors had become more willing to pursue older homicide cases when reliable evidence remained available. Across the United States, numerous cold cases were successfully prosecuted despite the passage of several decades. These cases demonstrated that the age of an investigation did not necessarily prevent accountability. If sufficient evidence existed, prosecution remained possible. Investigators handling Irene Garza's case recognized that principle. Their objective was no longer simply preserving the historical record. They intended to determine whether the available evidence could satisfy the legal standard required for criminal charges. The renewed inquiry required close cooperation between local investigators, forensic laboratories, and prosecutors. Every conclusion had to be supported by documented evidence. Every witness statement required careful verification. Every forensic result needed independent confirmation. Cold case investigations demand patience because mistakes become increasingly difficult to correct after many decades. By this stage, one reality had become unmistakable. Scientific progress had fundamentally altered the investigation. Questions that detectives in 1960 could only speculate about were now capable of being examined through laboratory analysis. The evidence had survived. Now it had to be interpreted using methods unavailable to the original investigators. As the review continued, prosecutors believed they were approaching the point at which the accumulated evidence could finally answer the question that had haunted South Texas since Easter 1960. After more than half a century, the case was moving again, not because memories had improved, but because science had caught up with history. By the beginning of the 2010s, the investigation into Irene Garza's murder had entered a decisive phase. More than 50 years had passed since her death, yet prosecutors believed the surviving evidence warranted one final comprehensive review. Detectives from the Texas Rangers, working alongside local authorities and prosecutors, re-examined the case with the benefit of decades of investigative experience and modern forensic capabilities. The challenge remained substantial. Many of the original investigators were no longer available to provide testimony. Some witnesses had died. Others struggled to remember events from more than half a century earlier. Documents had to be carefully organized, compared, and verified against original records. Despite these obstacles, the investigation steadily gained momentum. Cold case detectives approached the file with a simple principle: every statement should be evaluated alongside every available piece of physical evidence. Rather than relying on any single witness or isolated fact, investigators sought to determine whether the evidence, viewed collectively, established a consistent narrative. One important aspect of the renewed inquiry involved interviewing individuals who had known Father John Fite over the years. Several witnesses described conversations they claimed had occurred decades earlier. According to court records and later testimony, some individuals reported that Father Fite had made statements concerning Irene Garza's death. Others described remarks that investigators considered potentially incriminating. Each account was carefully documented. Investigators did not assume every recollection was accurate simply because it had been repeated over time. Instead, they examined whether individual statements were consistent with independent evidence already contained within the investigative file. This process of corroboration proved essential. Prosecutors understood that any future criminal case would be scrutinized in detail. Defense attorneys would inevitably challenge the reliability of memories dating back several decades. The prosecution therefore needed evidence extending beyond recollections alone. At the same time, advances in forensic science continued to strengthen the investigation. Laboratory analysis was applied to biological evidence preserved since the original investigation. Modern DNA technology allowed scientists to examine material that investigators in 1960 had been unable to interpret fully. The scientific findings became one part of a much broader evidentiary picture. Importantly, prosecutors did not rely on DNA in isolation. Instead, they viewed forensic results together with witness testimony, historical records, investigative reports, and medical evidence. As the review progressed, investigators also reconstructed the timeline of Irene's final hours as accurately as possible. They confirmed that Irene had gone to Sacred Heart Church on the evening of April 16, 1960, intending to participate in confession before Easter. Witnesses consistently placed her at the church. Father John Fite acknowledged that he had heard her confession that evening. Those facts had never been seriously disputed. The central question remained what happened after confession concluded. That question had lingered unanswered for more than 5 decades. Gradually, investigators concluded that the evidence justified presenting the case to prosecutors for possible criminal charges. This was a significant decision. Charging a homicide after more than 50 years requires confidence that the available evidence can withstand judicial review. Prosecutors must determine not only whether they believe a suspect committed the crime, but also whether the evidence is legally sufficient to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The Hidalgo County District Attorney's Office reviewed the investigation in detail. The review included witness interviews conducted over many years, forensic findings, historical investigative records, and expert analysis. Ultimately, prosecutors concluded that the evidence supported filing a murder charge against John Fite. In February 2016, more than 55 years after Irene Garza's death, a grand jury indicted the former priest for murder. The announcement marked one of the most significant developments in the history of the case. For Irene's family, it represented a moment they had waited decades to see. Although many relatives who had participated in the original search were no longer alive, surviving family members expressed hope that the criminal justice system would finally examine the evidence in open court. The indictment also attracted national attention. News organizations across the United States reported that one of Texas' longest-running cold cases was finally moving toward trial. The extraordinary passage of time became a central feature of media coverage. More than half a century had elapsed between the crime and the indictment. Few homicide cases remain active for so long before reaching a courtroom. John Fite pleaded not guilty. As in every criminal case, the prosecution bore the burden of proving its allegations before a jury. Preparation for trial required extensive work. Attorneys reviewed thousands of pages of historical records. Witnesses were located and interviewed again. Experts prepared to explain forensic findings developed through modern scientific techniques. The court also addressed numerous legal issues arising from the age of the case. Evidence collected in 1960 had to be authenticated. Historical documents required verification. The admissibility of witness testimony was carefully evaluated under the applicable rules of evidence. These proceedings illustrated the complexity of prosecuting a decades-old homicide. Unlike a recent investigation, nearly every aspect of the case demanded historical reconstruction. The trial finally began in 2017. Jurors heard testimony concerning Irene Garza's disappearance, the discovery of her body, the original investigation, and the extensive efforts undertaken to re-examine the case decades later. Witnesses described events from 1960, as well as later conversations that investigators considered significant. Experts explained forensic evidence and investigative procedures. The jury was asked to consider all of the evidence together rather than focusing on any single element in isolation. For Irene's family, the trial represented something that had seemed almost unimaginable for decades. At last, the case was being heard before a court of law. After years during which the investigation appeared frozen, the evidence was finally presented in a public forum where it could be examined, challenged, and evaluated according to established legal standards. The outcome would determine whether one of Texas' most enduring cold cases would finally reach a judicial conclusion after more than half a century of unanswered questions. The courtroom proceedings surrounding the murder of Irene Garza represented the final stage of a journey that had begun more than 5 decades earlier. For many people following the case, the passage of time itself was almost impossible to comprehend. A crime that had once dominated headlines in South Texas had become a historical investigation. The young teacher whose disappearance shocked a community had become a symbol of perseverance for a family that refused to let her memory disappear. Now, in 2017, the questions that had remained unanswered since 1960 were placed before a jury. The prosecution's case centered on the argument that Irene's death was not the result of a forgotten mystery, but the outcome of a crime committed by someone known to her and trusted by the community. At the center of the trial was John Fite. Decades earlier, he had been a Catholic priest serving in McAllen. On the night Irene disappeared, he was the last known person to interact with her before she vanished from Sacred Heart Church. For prosecutors, that connection was a critical part of the case. However, the defense challenged the prosecution's interpretation of events. The passage of 57 years created significant challenges. Memories from 1960 had to be examined carefully. Witnesses were asked to recall conversations and circumstances that had occurred when many were much younger. The defense argued that memories could change over time, and that some testimony was unreliable, because it was based on events remembered decades later. The prosecution responded that the case was not built on a single memory or isolated statement. Instead, prosecutors presented a broader picture involving multiple witnesses, historical records, and forensic evidence. The trial became a careful examination of how justice functions when decades separate a crime from the courtroom. One of the most significant elements presented during the proceedings was the testimony of witnesses who had interacted with Irene, Father Fight, or individuals connected to the investigation. Their accounts helped establish the atmosphere surrounding Sacred Heart Church on the night of April 16, 1960. The jury heard about Irene's plans, her arrival at the church, and the circumstances surrounding her disappearance. They also heard testimony regarding statements allegedly made by Father Fight over the years. These accounts became an important part of the prosecution's argument. According to prosecutors, certain statements made after Irene's death demonstrated knowledge that went beyond what would have been publicly available at the time. The defense disputed those interpretations. The attorneys argued that the statements were being viewed through the perspective of decades of suspicion, and that they did not prove guilt. The jury's responsibility was to evaluate the evidence carefully and determine whether the prosecution had met the legal burden required for conviction. The trial also examined the historical investigation itself. Jurors learned how detectives in 1960 worked with the limited technology available at the time. In that era, investigators could not use DNA databases, advanced genetic testing, or modern digital analysis. They depended on interviews, physical evidence, and traditional investigative methods. The limitations of the period became a major theme. The original detectives had investigated the case thoroughly, but the tools available to them were fundamentally different from those available to investigators decades later. The emergence of forensic science had changed the possibilities of cold case investigations. Evidence once considered inconclusive could now be examined with greater precision. During the proceedings, experts explained how scientific methods had evolved, and how preserved evidence could provide information unavailable in earlier decades. The scientific testimony represented the bridge between two different eras of criminal investigation. One era relied primarily on human observation and traditional detective work. The other relied on laboratory analysis capable of revealing information hidden at the microscopic level. This contrast highlighted one of the central reasons the Irene Garza case remained active for so many years. The investigation had not simply continued without progress. Rather, it had waited for technology to reach the point where old evidence could be reconsidered. As the trial continued, the courtroom became a place where two different versions of history confronted each other. The prosecution presented a timeline in which Irene entered Sacred Heart Church, encountered the defendant, and later became the victim of a violent crime. The defense argued that the evidence did not conclusively prove that sequence of events and that reasonable doubt remained. The jury listened to both sides. After more than half a century of uncertainty, the final decision would rest with 12 people who had not been alive when the crime occurred. They were asked to evaluate evidence from a different generation and determine whether it proved responsibility beyond a reasonable doubt. Outside the courtroom, public interest remained intense. For many residents of the Rio Grande Valley, Irene's name had never been forgotten. Older members of the community remembered the fear and sadness that followed her disappearance in 1960. Younger generations knew her story through newspaper reports, documentaries, and family conversations. The trial represented more than a legal proceeding. It represented a community's attempt to confront a painful chapter from its past. For Irene's surviving relatives, the courtroom provided something they had waited decades to experience: the opportunity to have her story fully examined before a judge and jury. The trial also raised broader questions about cold cases. How should society pursue justice when evidence survives longer than memories? How can courts fairly evaluate events separated from the present by generations? And how does a legal system balance the need for accountability with the difficulties created by the passage of time? The Irene Garza case became an example of those challenges. It demonstrated both the extraordinary power of modern investigative techniques and the limitations that remain when a crime reaches the courtroom decades later. After weeks of testimony, arguments, and evidence presentation, the trial approached its conclusion. The jury would soon be asked to make a decision that would finally determine whether the long investigation into Irene Garza's death would end with a conviction or remain another unresolved chapter in Texas criminal history. For more than 50 years, the question had remained the same. Who was responsible for the death of Irene Garza? Now, after generations of waiting, the answer was finally in the hands of the jury. After decades of unanswered questions, the murder trial of John Fite reached the moment that had seemed impossible for generations. A jury would finally decide whether the evidence was enough to hold someone responsible for the death of Irene Garza. The courtroom in Hidalgo County had become the center of attention not only for South Texas, but for people across the United States who had followed one of the longest-running homicide investigations in the region's history. The case was unusual in almost every way. The crime had occurred in 1960. The investigation had stretched across generations. The defendant was an elderly man facing accusations connected to events that had taken place when he was a young priest. And the victim, Irene Garza, had remained at the center of the case for more than 50 years. For the prosecution, the trial represented the culmination of years of investigation. Prosecutors argued that the evidence, when viewed as a whole, demonstrated that Fite was responsible for Irene's death. They presented the jury with a timeline beginning on the evening of April 16, 1960. Irene had gone to Sacred Heart Church for confession before Easter. She entered the church as a respected young teacher preparing for a religious holiday. She never returned home. Her body was discovered days later in a canal. The medical examination established that she had been assaulted and strangled. The prosecution argued that the circumstances surrounding her disappearance pointed toward someone who had access to the church and who could have encountered Irene privately that evening. The defense, however, challenged that interpretation. Attorneys for Fite maintained that suspicion had surrounded him for decades, but that suspicion was not proof. They argued that the passage of time created uncertainty, and that some evidence presented by prosecutors depended on memories that had aged over many years. The defense emphasized a central principle of criminal law: a person cannot be convicted unless the evidence proves guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The jury had to consider not what might have happened but what could be proven. Throughout the trial, jurors heard from witnesses whose lives had intersected with the investigation at different points. Some testified about events surrounding the original disappearance. Others described conversations they claimed had occurred years after Irene's death. Their testimony required jurors to evaluate not only what was said but also when it was said, under what circumstances, and whether other evidence supported those accounts. Cold cases often depend on connections between small pieces of information. A statement from decades earlier. A document preserved in an investigative file. A scientific analysis unavailable to the original detectives. A memory that becomes significant only when viewed alongside new discoveries. The Garza case reflected that complexity. The prosecution also highlighted the importance of the original investigation. Although detectives in 1960 lacked modern forensic tools, they had carefully documented the circumstances surrounding Irene's disappearance and death. Those early records provided the foundation for later investigators. Without those documents, much of the historical reconstruction would have been impossible. The trial demonstrated how investigations can evolve over time. A case that once depended almost entirely on interviews and physical observations eventually became an examination involving modern forensic science, historical analysis, and legal review. The jury was asked to bridge the gap between two eras of criminal investigation. The first began in 1960, when detectives searched for answers with limited technology. The second began decades later, when advances in science allowed investigators to revisit evidence from the past. For Irene's family, the proceedings carried profound emotional significance. Many relatives had spent most of their adult lives without knowing whether anyone would ever be held accountable. The trial brought the details of Irene's final hours back into public view. It reminded the community that behind every legal argument was a real person whose life had been cut short. Irene was not simply the subject of a famous cold case. She was a daughter, a sister, a teacher, a friend. The prosecution repeatedly returned to that human element, reminding jurors that the case was ultimately about the death of a young woman, whose future had been taken away. The defense focused on another important aspect of the legal system: the requirement for certainty. A decades-old case creates unique difficulties. People forget. Documents disappear. Circumstances change. The defense argued that these challenges created reasonable doubt. The jury's task was to decide whether the evidence overcame those uncertainties. After weeks of testimony, both sides delivered their closing arguments. The prosecution urged jurors to consider the entire body of evidence, rather than examining each piece separately. They argued that the combined weight of witness testimony, investigative history, and forensic findings established responsibility. The defense asked jurors to remain cautious. They argued that the state had not eliminated every reasonable alternative explanation, and that the burden of proof had not been satisfied. Then the case moved into the hands of the jury. For the first time since 1960, a group of people would formally evaluate the evidence and provide an answer. The deliberations carried enormous significance. A conviction would mark the end of a decades-long pursuit of justice. An acquittal would leave the case permanently unresolved. Outside the courthouse, interest remained high. The story of Irene Garza had survived longer than many of the people originally connected to it. The investigation had outlived detectives, witnesses, and generations of residents who first remembered the tragedy. Yet her name continued to be spoken. Her photograph continued to represent the unanswered questions that had surrounded the case for decades. The jury eventually reached its decision. After considering the evidence presented during the trial, jurors found John Fite guilty of murder. The verdict represented a historic moment in Texas criminal justice. More than 50 years after Irene Garza was killed, a courtroom had finally reached a legal conclusion. For Irene's surviving family members, the verdict brought a measure of closure after a lifetime of uncertainty. It could not restore the years that had been lost. It could not erase the pain caused by her death. But it answered the question that had remained unanswered for more than half a century. The case of Irene Garza demonstrated the extraordinary persistence of cold case investigations. It showed that time does not always silence evidence. It showed that advances in science can transform forgotten clues into critical information. And it revealed how a community can continue searching for answers long after the world has moved on. However, even after the verdict, the story of Irene Garza remained more than a courtroom outcome. It remained a reminder of the human cost behind every unsolved case. Because behind every file, every piece of evidence, and every legal argument is a person whose life mattered. For decades, Irene's family waited for justice. For decades, investigators carried the weight of an unfinished case. And for decades, the question surrounding her death remained suspended between memory and uncertainty. Until finally, after more than half a century, the silence was broken. The conviction of John Fite marked a historic conclusion to one of Texas' longest-running homicide investigations, but the story of Irene Garza did not end with the courtroom verdict. For more than 50 years, her name had represented an unanswered question. Her death had remained a painful memory for a family that refused to stop searching, and for a community that never fully forgot the young teacher who disappeared during Holy Week in 1960. The legal process had finally reached its conclusion, but the significance of the case extended far beyond one defendant and one trial. The murder of Irene Garza became an example of how criminal investigations can survive across generations. When detectives first arrived at Sacred Heart Church in 1960, they were working in a completely different era of law enforcement. There were no national DNA databases, no computerized records, no digital communication systems, no modern forensic laboratories capable of analyzing microscopic traces left behind at a crime scene. Investigators relied on determination, interviews, and physical evidence that could be collected using the methods of the time. They searched. They questioned witnesses. They followed leads. But the technology needed to fully analyze certain evidence had not yet been developed. The case demonstrated a reality familiar to many cold case investigators. Sometimes an investigation is not truly abandoned. Sometimes it is simply waiting for the right tools. Decades later, those tools arrived. Advances in forensic science changed the way law enforcement approached historical cases. DNA analysis became one of the most powerful developments in criminal investigations, allowing scientists to examine biological evidence at a level unimaginable in 1960. For many cold cases, evidence that once appeared limited or inconclusive gained new importance. The Irene Garza investigation followed this pattern. The case was not solved because of one sudden discovery. It was solved through the gradual accumulation of information, the preservation of evidence, the work of multiple generations of investigators, and the ability of modern science to revisit questions that had remained unanswered for decades. The investigation also highlighted the importance of perseverance from victims' families. Many cold cases disappear from public attention over time. Headlines fade. Communities change. New crimes replace old ones in the public conversation. But for families, the passage of time does not erase loss. The Garza family continued carrying the memory of Irene long after the original investigation slowed. Every anniversary of her death represented another reminder of what had been taken away. Every year without answers represented another unanswered question. Their continued search became an important part of keeping the case alive. The broader community also played a role. Residents of McAllen remembered Irene not only because of the tragedy surrounding her death, but because of who she had been before the crime. She was remembered as a teacher who influenced young lives. She was remembered as a woman devoted to her faith. She was remembered as someone whose future had been interrupted before it could fully unfold. This distinction was important. Cold cases are often discussed through evidence and investigations, but behind every file is a person with relationships, dreams, and a life that existed before the crime. Irene's story was not only about how she died. It was also about how she lived. The case also raised broader discussions about the challenges of prosecuting crimes decades after they occur. A modern criminal trial requires careful examination of evidence, regardless of how much time has passed. Courts must balance the pursuit of justice with the rights of defendants. Witness memories must be tested. Evidence must be verified. Investigators must demonstrate that conclusions are based on facts rather than assumptions. The Irene Garza case reflected these challenges. The prosecution had to present evidence from a different era, while the defense questioned whether that evidence could still provide a reliable basis for conviction after more than half a century. The jury ultimately accepted the prosecution's argument and returned a guilty verdict. But the trial itself demonstrated why cold cases are among the most complex investigations in the criminal justice system. Time can create obstacles that no investigator can completely eliminate. Witnesses may no longer be available. Physical evidence may deteriorate. Historical records may contain gaps. Yet time can also create opportunities. New technology can examine old evidence. New investigators can identify patterns overlooked by previous generations. New methods can transform unanswered questions into evidence. The murder of Irene Garza became one of those cases where history and modern science eventually met. The investigation also had a lasting impact on how cold cases are viewed. For decades, many people believed that crimes without immediate solutions were destined to remain mysteries forever. The Garza case challenged that assumption. It showed that unresolved does not necessarily mean unsolvable. A case can remain dormant while still holding the possibility of resolution. Evidence can wait. Investigations can be renewed. Justice can arrive later than anyone expected. However, even after the conviction, some questions surrounding the case continued to generate discussion. Cold cases often leave behind layers of history that cannot be completely reconstructed. Different people remember events differently. Some details remain uncertain. Some individuals connected to the original investigation are no longer alive to explain their actions or decisions. This is one of the realities of examining crimes from the distant past. Investigators and historians must work with what remains. They must separate documented facts from speculation. They must recognize both what is known and what remains uncertain. In Irene Garza's case, the most important facts were clear. A young teacher disappeared after visiting Sacred Heart Church. Her body was discovered days later. Her death was ruled a homicide. The investigation remained unresolved for decades. Modern forensic methods and renewed investigative efforts eventually led to a criminal conviction. Those facts formed the foundation of one of Texas' most closely followed cold case investigations. The story also served as a reminder of the importance of preserving evidence. Every piece of material collected during an investigation may hold future value. Technology changes. Scientific methods evolve. Evidence considered limited today may become significant tomorrow. The detectives who investigated Irene's murder in 1960 could not have known what future science would make possible. But their efforts created the foundation for investigators who came decades later. Their work ensured that the case was not forgotten completely. More than 50 years separated the crime from the courtroom. A generation had passed. Then another. The world changed dramatically during that time. Yet one thing remained constant: the search for answers. The case of Irene Garza became a story about patience, persistence, and the ability of justice systems to revisit the past. It showed that victims' names can survive beyond headlines. It showed that families can continue fighting even when decades pass without resolution. And it showed that sometimes the smallest surviving details can eventually become the evidence that changes everything. For McAllen, the story of Irene Garza remained a permanent part of local history. For her family, it remained the story of a beloved daughter and sister whose life ended far too soon. And for investigators, it became a powerful example of why no cold case should be considered completely forgotten. Because even after decades of silence, the truth can still find a way to emerge. The story of Irene Garza's murder became one of the most closely examined cold cases in Texas, not only because of the time it took to reach a courtroom, but because it represented the difficult relationship between memory, evidence, and justice. When the crime occurred in 1960, the investigation unfolded in a world that looked completely different from the one that existed decades later. The methods available to detectives were limited by the science of their time. Investigators could document physical evidence, collect statements, and build timelines, but they could not access the powerful forensic technologies that would later transform criminal investigations. The passage of time became both the greatest obstacle and, unexpectedly, one of the most important factors in the case. Time created uncertainty, but time also allowed science to advance. The murder of Irene Garza demonstrated how investigations can evolve long after the original crime scene has disappeared. In the early days following Irene's disappearance, the priority was simple: find her and determine what happened. The community mobilized. Volunteers searched. Police officers followed leads. Family members waited for news that they hoped would bring Irene home safely. Instead, the discovery of her body changed everything. The investigation immediately shifted from a missing person case to a murder inquiry. The emotional impact on McAllen was profound. Residents who had viewed their community as peaceful and secure suddenly confronted the reality that a violent crime had occurred among them. The circumstances surrounding Irene's death created additional shock because of the location connected to her final known moments. A church was supposed to represent safety, trust, and spiritual guidance. For many people, the idea that violence could occur after Irene entered a place of worship was deeply disturbing. That contrast became one of the reasons the case remained so memorable. Over the years, investigators repeatedly returned to the same fundamental questions. What happened inside Sacred Heart Church that evening? Who had the opportunity to harm Irene? What evidence could prove the identity of the person responsible? The answers did not come quickly. The original investigation produced suspicion, but suspicion alone could not complete a criminal case. Law enforcement agencies must operate within legal standards. They must collect evidence that can be tested, challenged, and presented in court. In 1960, investigators did not have enough evidence to bring the case to trial. The file remained open. The years passed, but the case never completely disappeared. One reason was the continued attention from the community. Residents who remembered Irene continued sharing her story. Local journalists revisited the investigation. Researchers and investigators examined old records. The case remained part of public memory because it represented more than a single crime. It represented a promise that victims of unsolved crimes should not simply be forgotten. The renewed investigation decades later required a different approach. Detectives examining cold cases must often reconstruct history. They study documents created by investigators who are no longer available. They review interviews conducted with witnesses who may have aged significantly. They compare information gathered at different points in time. The goal is to determine whether the original conclusions still stand, or whether new information changes the understanding of events. In Irene's case, investigators approached the evidence with modern methods, while respecting the work of those who had investigated the crime decades earlier. They did not begin with a blank page. They began with a mountain of history. Every report, every statement, and every piece of preserved evidence represented a part of the investigation's long journey. The development of DNA technology changed the landscape of criminal justice. Before DNA testing became widely available, many investigations depended heavily on eyewitness accounts and traditional forensic techniques. DNA introduced a new possibility. Biological evidence could provide a connection between individuals and crimes with a level of precision that had previously been impossible. Across the United States, cold case investigations began experiencing breakthroughs. Cases that had remained unsolved for decades were reopened. Evidence stored for years was tested again. Suspects who had avoided identification for generations were finally connected to crimes through scientific analysis. The Irene Garza case became part of this broader transformation in law enforcement. However, solving a cold case is rarely as simple as discovering DNA. Science can provide important information, but investigators must still build a complete case. They must explain the evidence. They must establish timelines. They must connect facts together in a way that meets the standards of the justice system. The investigation into Irene's murder required exactly that type of careful reconstruction. Prosecutors had to present not only what happened but why the evidence demonstrated responsibility. They had to explain events from 1960 to a jury living in a completely different era. The courtroom became the place where decades of investigation were examined. Witnesses spoke about events separated from the present by more than half a century. Experts explained scientific findings. Attorneys debated the meaning of evidence collected across generations. The trial was not simply about the past. It was about whether the past could still be proven. For many cold case investigations, the greatest challenge is not finding information. It is proving that the information is reliable. A statement made in 1960 may have different significance when examined decades later. A piece of evidence collected long ago may require careful explanation. A memory preserved for years may contain both valuable details and unavoidable imperfections. The legal system must consider all of these factors. The Irene Garza trial became an example of this complicated process. It showed how justice can depend on the cooperation of multiple generations. The detectives who first investigated the case. The scientists who developed new forensic techniques. The investigators who reopened old files. The prosecutors who presented the evidence. And the family members who continued seeking answers. Each played a role in bringing the case back into public attention. The conviction of John Fite did not erase the decades of pain experienced by Irene's family. No verdict can restore a life lost. No courtroom decision can return the years stolen by tragedy. But the legal outcome provided an answer to a question that had remained unresolved for more than half a century. It demonstrated that a case can remain alive even when decades pass. It demonstrated that evidence can outlast memory. And it demonstrated that the pursuit of justice does not always follow a predictable timeline. Sometimes justice arrives quickly. Sometimes it takes years. And in the case of Irene Garza, it took more than 50 years. But the search continued until the evidence, the investigation, and the legal system finally reached the same conclusion. The story of Irene Garza remains a reminder that behind every cold case is a person whose life mattered. Before the headlines, before the investigation, before the courtroom, there was Irene. A teacher. A daughter. A friend. A young woman whose future was taken away, but whose name continued to be remembered. And because that memory survived, the case survived. And because the case survived, the search for answers continued until the silence was finally broken. For decades, the murder of Irene Garza existed between two worlds. In one world, there was the official investigation, reports, interviews, evidence records, and legal procedures. In the other, there was the human reality. A family mourning a daughter, a community remembering a teacher, and a question that remained unanswered through generations. The case demonstrated one of the most difficult truths about homicide investigations. Finding the truth is not always a matter of time. Sometimes it is a matter of having the right evidence, the right technology, and the determination to continue searching. When Irene Garza was killed in 1960, investigators could not have predicted that her case would become a landmark example of the challenges and possibilities of cold case justice. At the time, detectives followed the procedures available to them. They collected statements. They examined the crime scene. They investigated people connected to Irene's final hours. They worked to identify the person responsible. But the investigation reached a point where the available evidence could not produce a criminal conviction. The case remained unresolved. Yet the absence of an arrest did not mean the investigation had failed completely. The work performed by those early detectives created the foundation for future investigators. Their records preserved information. Their interviews captured memories. Their documentation ensured that the case could one day be examined again. This became one of the most important lessons from Irene's story. Cold cases are not simply old cases. They are unfinished investigations waiting for new opportunities. Those opportunities often come from changes in technology. During the decades after Irene's death, forensic science experienced a dramatic transformation. Criminal investigations entered an era where evidence once considered impossible to analyze could reveal new information. DNA testing became one of the most important tools in modern law enforcement. The science allowed investigators to examine biological material and compare genetic profiles with known individuals. For cold case detectives, this development represented a major change. Evidence that had remained silent for years could now provide answers. However, DNA was only one part of the process. A forensic result does not solve a case by itself. Investigators must still establish context. They must determine how evidence connects to the crime. They must explain why it matters. The Irene Garza investigation reflected this reality. The final resolution came from combining multiple elements accumulated over decades: scientific analysis, historical records, witness information, investigative review. Each piece contributed to a larger picture. This approach is common in complex homicide investigations. Rarely does one single fact explain everything. Instead, investigators build a chain of evidence. One detail supports another. One discovery gives meaning to another piece of information. Over time, a clearer picture emerges. The renewed attention surrounding Irene's case also highlighted the importance of preserving evidence. Many cold cases are lost forever because critical materials disappear over time. Documents may be damaged. Physical evidence may be improperly stored. Witnesses may no longer be available. In Irene's case, enough information survived to allow investigators to revisit the circumstances of her death decades later. That survival was significant. It represented a connection between investigators from different generations. The detectives of 1960 and the investigators of the 21st century were separated by more than 50 years, but they were working toward the same goal: understanding what happened to Irene Garza. The case also revealed the emotional complexity of delayed justice. For Irene's family, the passage of time brought both hope and pain. Hope remained because the investigation was never completely forgotten. Pain remained because every year without answers represented another year without accountability. When the case finally moved forward, it brought attention to a question faced by many families of homicide victims. What does justice mean after decades have passed? A conviction cannot restore the person who was lost. It cannot erase the suffering experienced by relatives. It cannot return the future that was taken away. But accountability can provide something important. It can confirm that the victim's life mattered. It can acknowledge that the crime was real. It can establish that the search for truth was worthwhile. For the people of McAllen, Irene Garza remained more than a name connected to an old investigation. She represented a part of the community's history. Many residents who remembered the case from 1960 grew older while waiting for answers. Some never lived to see the final outcome. Their memories became part of the story. The investigation also became a reminder of how communities respond to tragedy. In the aftermath of Irene's disappearance, people searched together. They shared information. They supported her family. Although they could not immediately provide answers, they refused to allow her story to disappear. That collective memory played an important role in keeping public attention alive. The case also demonstrated the importance of reviewing old investigations without prejudice. Cold case detectives must examine previous conclusions carefully. They must be willing to question assumptions. They must look at familiar evidence from a new perspective. Sometimes the answer is hidden not because evidence was unavailable, but because the tools to understand it had not yet been developed. This was one of the defining elements of Irene Garza's case. The investigation did not end because people stopped caring. It continued because people continued searching. Years after the crime, investigators returned to evidence collected decades earlier. They asked new questions. They applied new methods. They examined old information through a modern lens. The result was a renewed understanding of a case that had remained unresolved for most of a lifetime. The story of Irene Garza also became part of a larger national conversation about cold cases. Across the United States, thousands of families wait for similar answers. Some cases are solved quickly. Others remain unresolved for decades. But each one carries the same basic reality. Behind every investigation is a person. Behind every file is a family. Behind every unanswered question is a story that deserves to be remembered. Irene's story endured because people refused to let time erase her. Her family continued seeking answers. Investigators continued examining evidence. The justice system eventually considered the facts in court. More than 50 years after her death, the case reached a conclusion. But the importance of the investigation extended beyond the verdict. It showed what can happen when determination meets scientific progress. It showed that evidence can survive longer than expected. It showed that even the oldest mysteries may still contain answers. The murder of Irene Garza began as a tragedy that shocked a small Texas community. Over time, it became an example of patience, perseverance, and the evolving nature of criminal investigation. A case that began with uncertainty eventually reached a courtroom. A question that remained unanswered for generations eventually received a legal answer. And a woman whose life ended far too soon continued to be remembered, not because of the crime committed against her, but because of the life she lived and the people who never stopped searching for justice. The resolution of the Irene Garza case represented more than the conclusion of a criminal investigation. It represented the end of a journey that had crossed generations, technological revolutions, and profound changes in the way society understands justice. When Irene disappeared in 1960, her family and investigators could not have imagined that the search for answers would continue for more than half a century. At the time, the investigation was immediate and urgent. A young woman had vanished. A community demanded answers. Police officers worked through the night searching for information that could explain where Irene had gone. But as days became months and months became years, the case entered a different stage. The urgency of the original investigation faded into the slow persistence of a cold case. Yet the unanswered questions remained. For Irene's family, the passage of time did not transform the tragedy into history. It remained personal. It remained present. The photographs, memories, and stories of Irene continue to represent the life that had been lost. This human element is often overlooked when discussing cold cases. Investigations are frequently described through evidence, suspects, and legal proceedings. But at the center of every homicide case is a person. Someone who had dreams. Someone who had relationships. Someone whose absence changed the lives of everyone who loved them. Irene Garza was remembered not because she became part of a famous criminal investigation, but because of the person she was before the tragedy. She was a teacher who dedicated herself to educating children. She was a member of her community. She was a daughter whose family expected to see her return home that evening. The investigation that followed her death became an effort to protect that memory. Over the years, different generations of law enforcement officers became connected to the case. Some investigators were not even born when Irene was killed. Yet they inherited the responsibility of examining what previous investigators had left behind. This is one of the unique aspects of cold case work. Detectives investigating modern crimes often begin with fresh evidence. Cold case investigators begin with history. They must understand the original investigation before they can determine what new information may exist. They examine old reports. They study previous interviews. They analyze evidence collection methods. They consider whether new technology can reveal information that was previously unavailable. The Irene Garza investigation required exactly this type of careful examination. The case had passed through multiple eras of policing. The original detectives worked in an age dominated by traditional investigation methods. Later investigators worked in an era shaped by forensic science. The connection between these two periods was the evidence that survived. The development of DNA analysis changed criminal investigations worldwide. It transformed the way investigators viewed old cases. Previously, biological evidence might have been considered limited. With modern testing, the same evidence could potentially provide new information decades later. This scientific progress changed the relationship between time and justice. Before advanced forensic technology, many investigators believed that old cases became increasingly difficult with every passing year. Today, while challenges remain, time does not necessarily mean the disappearance of all possibilities. Sometimes time creates opportunities. Scientific methods improve. Databases expand. Investigators gain new perspectives. A case that once seemed impossible may eventually become solvable. The Irene Garza investigation became an example of this changing reality. However, the case also demonstrated that technology alone is never enough. A successful cold case investigation requires cooperation between many people. Scientists analyze evidence. Detectives reconstruct events. Prosecutors evaluate legal standards. Witnesses provide information. Families continue advocating for answers. Each part of the process contributes to the final result. The prosecution of John Fight showed how complicated it can be to bring a decades-old homicide case into court. The legal system must consider evidence carefully, especially when events occurred long before the trial. A jury must determine whether the evidence proves guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. This standard exists to protect the fairness of the justice system. It requires prosecutors to present facts, not simply theories. The Irene Garza trial became a public examination of that process. The courtroom became the place where decades of investigation were reviewed. Evidence collected in the past was examined in the present. Memories from long ago were tested. Scientific findings were explained. The jury was asked to decide whether the evidence established responsibility. The eventual conviction brought a legal conclusion to the case. But the broader significance of Irene's story remained. It demonstrated that investigations can continue even when years pass. It demonstrated the importance of preserving evidence. It demonstrated the impact of scientific progress. And it demonstrated the determination of families who continue searching for answers long after many people have forgotten the case. The story also serves as a reminder of the limitations of memory. Human recollection is powerful, but it is not perfect. Over decades, memories can change. Details can become unclear. Events can be remembered differently by different people. This is why investigators rely on multiple sources of information. A strong case is rarely built on one statement or one piece of evidence. Instead, it is created through connections. A timeline. A document. A forensic result. A witness account. A pattern. Together, these elements can reveal a truth that no individual piece could establish alone. The Irene Garza case followed this principle. Its resolution came after years of examination and careful evaluation of information gathered across generations. The case also highlighted the importance of never losing sight of victims. In many criminal investigations, public attention focuses heavily on suspects and legal battles. But the reason these investigations exist is because someone lost their life. For Irene's family, the case was never only about a conviction. It was about recognition. It was about acknowledging what happened. It was about ensuring that Irene's story did not end with silence. Today, the murder of Irene Garza remains one of the most notable cold cases in Texas history. Its significance comes not only from the length of the investigation but from what it represents. A crime committed in one era. Investigated through another. Resolved through the combination of persistence and modern science. The case became an example of how justice can move slowly but still move forward. More than 5 decades separated the crime from the courtroom. A lifetime passed between the night Irene disappeared and the moment accountability was reached. Yet throughout those years, one fact remained unchanged. A young woman lost her life. A family lost someone they loved. And a community continued asking for answers. The passage of time did not erase the importance of those questions. Instead, it made the search for answers even more significant. Because every cold case carries the same message. Silence does not always mean the end. Sometimes evidence waits. Sometimes investigations wait. And sometimes, after many years have passed, the truth finally has the opportunity to be heard. The case of Irene Garza remained a powerful example of how the pursuit of justice can extend beyond a single lifetime. It was not simply a story about a crime that occurred in 1960. It was a story about the decades that followed, the investigations that continued, the questions that remained unanswered, and the people who refused to allow the passage of time to erase the memory of a young woman whose life ended far too soon. When investigators first began searching for answers, they were working with the tools and knowledge available during that period. The investigation depended on human observation. Detectives relied on conversations. They studied behavior. They followed leads based on information provided by witnesses. They attempted to reconstruct events through the evidence they could collect. But the limitations of the era were significant. Modern forensic science had not yet arrived. The methods that would later transform criminal investigations were still decades away. The original investigators could not know that technology would eventually create new possibilities. They could only work with what they had. Their efforts became the foundation for everything that followed. The survival of the case file itself became a crucial part of the story. Cold cases depend on preservation. Without records, evidence, and documentation, future investigators have little opportunity to reopen the investigation. The Irene Garza case survived because information remained available for later generations to examine. Decades after the murder, investigators were able to return to the original material and ask new questions. They were able to look beyond the conclusions of the past and evaluate the evidence through modern methods. This process is common in major cold case investigations. A new investigation does not erase the work of previous detectives. Instead, it builds upon it. Each generation contributes another layer of understanding. The investigators of 1960 established the timeline. Later investigators examined the evidence with new technology. Prosecutors evaluated whether the combined information met the requirements of the legal system. Together, these efforts created a path toward resolution. The case also demonstrated the emotional weight carried by families of homicide victims. For Irene's relatives, the years after her death were marked by uncertainty. They had to live without knowing exactly what had happened. They had to carry unanswered questions through holidays, anniversaries, and family milestones. The passage of time changed many things. People moved. Communities evolved. Generations grew older. But the absence left behind by Irene's death remained. The eventual progress in the case provided recognition that the search for answers had mattered. It showed that the pain experienced by victims' families was not forgotten. It showed that unresolved cases could still receive attention. The investigation also highlighted the changing relationship between law enforcement and technology. For much of history, investigators depended primarily on physical evidence visible to the human eye. Fingerprints, documents, witness statements, objects connected to a crime. But advances in forensic science changed that approach. Evidence could now exist at a microscopic level. Biological traces could contain information. Materials once considered insignificant could become valuable years later. This transformation reshaped criminal investigations around the world. The Irene Garza case became part of that larger story. It showed how modern science can revisit the past without changing the facts of history. The events of 1960 remained the same. What changed was the ability to understand them. The case also illustrated the importance of careful legal review. A criminal conviction requires more than public belief or suspicion. Courts must examine evidence according to established standards. Prosecutors must prove their case. Defense attorneys must challenge the evidence. A jury must consider both sides before reaching a decision. This process is especially important in historical cases where decades separate the crime from the trial. The Irene Garza proceedings reflected these challenges. The courtroom became a place where different generations of evidence were brought together. The jury had to consider events from a distant past, while applying modern legal standards. The trial also created an opportunity for the public to revisit Irene's life. Beyond the investigation, beyond the legal arguments, and beyond the years of uncertainty was the story of a young woman who had been deeply valued by those around her. Her identity was not defined only by what happened to her. She was remembered as a teacher who cared about her students. She was remembered as a person of faith. She was remembered as someone whose presence had a positive impact on the people around her. That memory became one of the reasons the case continued to matter. Cold cases often become symbols because they represent a promise. A promise that victims will not simply become forgotten names. A promise that unanswered questions can still be examined. A promise that time does not automatically erase responsibility. The murder of Irene Garza became one of those cases. Its resolution required patience. It required scientific advancement. It required investigators willing to revisit decades-old evidence. And it required a family and community willing to continue remembering. The case also provided lessons for future investigations. One lesson was the importance of preserving evidence. Another was the value of reviewing old cases with an open mind. A third was the understanding that justice can take many years to achieve. The world in which Irene lived in 1960 was very different from the world that examined her case decades later. Technology changed. Society changed. Law enforcement changed. But the fundamental question remained unchanged. Who was responsible for her death? The answer eventually came through a process that combined the past and the present. Old evidence. New science. Historical investigation. Legal examination. The case was a reminder that every investigation exists within a specific moment in time. Detectives can only use the tools available to them. But future generations may discover new ways to interpret what was left behind. This is why cold cases continue to receive attention. They represent the possibility that unanswered questions may still have answers. The story of Irene Garza was not only about a crime from decades earlier. It was about the endurance of memory. It was about the persistence of investigators. It was about the ability of science to reveal information hidden by time. And it was about a community that continued to remember a woman whose life had ended tragically. More than half a century after Irene entered Sacred Heart Church, her name remained connected to one of Texas' most significant criminal investigations. Her story became a reminder that justice does not always follow a straight path. Sometimes it requires decades. Sometimes it requires generations. But as long as evidence remains, as long as questions remain, and as long as people continue searching, a case is never completely silent. The story of Irene Garza is ultimately a story about time. Time was the force that separated the crime from the courtroom. Time was the reason memories faded, witnesses disappeared, and the original investigation became increasingly difficult to revisit. But time was also the reason new possibilities emerged. Because while decades passed, science continued to advance. And because evidence had survived, investigators were eventually able to return to a case that had remained unresolved for generations. When Irene was killed in 1960, no one could have predicted how long the search for answers would continue. The people who first investigated her death worked with dedication, but they were limited by the technology of their era. They followed leads. They collected information. They attempted to understand a crime that had devastated their community. Yet some questions remained beyond their ability to answer. The passage of years transformed the case from an active investigation into a historical mystery. But it never became forgotten. The name Irene Garza continued to represent a life interrupted and a question unanswered. For her family, the absence of justice was not an abstract concept. It was something experienced every day. It existed in memories. It existed in photographs. It existed in the empty space left behind by someone who should have lived many more years. The eventual resolution of the case demonstrated the importance of persistence. It showed that investigations do not always move forward in a predictable way. Sometimes progress happens quickly. Sometimes progress requires decades. But the pursuit of truth can continue even when answers seem impossible. The investigation into Irene's death also showed how criminal justice evolves. The detectives of 1960 could not use the tools available to investigators decades later. They could not access modern DNA analysis. They could not rely on digital databases. They could not examine evidence using the advanced laboratory techniques that exist today. However, their work still mattered. Their reports, observations, and evidence preservation created the foundation that allowed later investigators to continue. Every investigation is part of a larger timeline. One generation begins the search. Another generation continues it. A later generation may finally reach the answer. This connection between past and present is one of the defining characteristics of cold case investigations. The case of Irene Garza also revealed the importance of recognizing victims as more than the crimes committed against them. When a homicide investigation lasts for decades, public attention often focuses on suspects, evidence, and courtroom arguments. But the center of the story remains the person whose life was taken. Irene was a teacher. She was a member of a family. She was part of a community. Before she became the subject of an investigation, she was a person with hopes, relationships, and a future ahead of her. Remembering that human reality is essential. The purpose of solving a cold case is not only to identify responsibility. It is also to acknowledge the value of the life that was lost. The resolution of the Irene Garza case became significant because it answered a question that had remained open for more than 50 years. It provided a legal conclusion. It confirmed that the investigation had not been abandoned. And it demonstrated that the passage of time does not always prevent accountability. The case also became an important example of the role of forensic science in modern justice. DNA technology has changed the way investigators approach old crimes. Evidence once considered limited can now reveal information that was previously impossible to obtain. But science alone does not solve cases. Behind every forensic breakthrough are investigators who ask the right questions. Scientists who carefully analyze evidence. Prosecutors who evaluate legal standards. Families who continue demanding answers. The resolution of Irene's case came from the combination of all these efforts. It was not the result of one moment. It was the result of decades of work. The case also serves as a reminder that justice is not measured only by speed. Ideally, crimes are solved quickly. Victims' families deserve immediate answers. Communities deserve safety and accountability. But when a case remains unresolved, the search does not lose its importance. The passage of time does not reduce the value of justice. It can make the journey more difficult, but it does not make the goal less meaningful. For McAllen, Irene Garza remains an important part of local history. Her story continues to be discussed not only because of the crime, but because of the determination shown by those who sought answers. The investigation became a symbol of perseverance. A reminder that cases can survive beyond the careers of individual detectives. A reminder that evidence can survive beyond the era in which it was collected. A reminder that truth can sometimes emerge after many years of silence. The murder of Irene Garza began as a tragedy that shocked a community. It became one of Texas' most notable cold cases. And eventually, it became an example of how old investigations can be transformed by modern science and renewed determination. More than 5 decades separated the night Irene disappeared from the moment the legal system reached its conclusion. During that time, the world changed. Technology changed. Investigative methods changed. But the importance of finding answers remained the same. Because every victim deserves to be remembered. Every family deserves to be heard. And every unanswered question deserves the opportunity to be investigated. The story of Irene Garza continues to stand as a reminder that time may delay justice, But it does not always defeat it. Evidence can remain. Questions can remain. Hope can remain. And sometimes, after decades of waiting, the truth can finally emerge.